We are finding quite a lot in that Sermon on the Mount, aren't we? And we're finding that there are two ways of life given us there. The old way of the ancient Hebrews, who were attempting in their way to live the moral life. You will remember that was brought out in spiritual interpretation of Scripture. How that the law came by Moses, grace and truth by Christ Jesus, and that Moses had presented to the Hebrews this higher moral way of life. It isn't surprising that they needed it. Remember, they had been in slavery for hundreds of years, had had no access at all to education, culture, religion, art, sciences, and living in that state of slavery, it would be no wonder if they were living without any great developed moral sense. But a moral sense is only a step on the way to spiritual consciousness. And a person may achieve the absolute life of obedience to the Ten Commandments and still be a million miles away from the God life, the spiritual way of life. Because the spiritual way of life is above the pairs of opposites. And here is where you must pay particular attention, because in your metaphysical experience you have probably devoted yourselves to overcoming error. That is, if there were disease in your life, the major part of your experience would be attaining health. And if there were economic lack, your use of a metaphysical teaching would be to establish a greater sense of abundance. And if there were sin, you would try to attain purity. If there were unhappy human relationships, you would of course try to attain a more joyous sense. Now actually, that has nothing to do with the message of the infinite way. The infinite way is not concerned with changing the negative sense of life into the positive, but rising above both the negative and the positive into the spiritual. I noticed today in this new book, The Art of Meditation, right in, I think, the very first chapter, that it says that we must rise above good health as well as above bad health. And that, of course, is a very difficult point to understand, because from a human standpoint it would be well enough if we could just become healthy or have a sufficiency of supply or normal human relationships. But that isn't enough on the spiritual path. Your righteousness has to be above the righteousness of all the good humans that ever lived, because the goal of our work is the attaining of Christ consciousness. It isn't the attaining of health. It isn't the attaining of supply. It isn't the attaining of a happy marriage. Our work is the attaining of Christ consciousness, and that is what is shown forth by the Master in this Sermon on the Mount, where he first points out the Hebrew moral way of life, and then says that my kingdom is not of this world. Just think of that. My kingdom is not of this world. My peace give I unto you, but not as the world giveth. There you have two entirely different lives set forth, and this has never been brought forth in our spiritual teachings until now. I'm pointing it out to you. Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. And there you see that if you judge good, you will be judged good. If you judge evil, you will be judged evil. But here he says not judge at all. Your aim isn't even to be judged good. Because remember, those who crowned him one day crucified him the next. And that still takes place in human experience. There's no use of going out and trying to gain the goodwill of your friends or the goodwill of your relatives or the goodwill of the public, for we have all seen how quickly all of that can change. And so there must be a higher step than judging even good. And that highest step is judge not. Now, in the practical application of this higher sense of life, this spiritual sense of life, you come to something like this. What man is there of you whom, if his son ask bread, will he give him a stone? Or if he ask a fish, will he give him a serpent? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask him? And there you come to the very central theme of this message of the infinite way. When you no longer judge, or when you no longer seek your own good, when you no longer use human weapons, physical or mental, you relax not into letting the world do what it wants with you, but you relax into that spirit which is in you in order to let it take over and govern your experience. There we come back to Paul. I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life. And so it is that when the Master is taken, he refuses to permit his disciples to defend him. Put up thy sword. Those that live by the sword will die by the sword. And that would seem, to material sense, as if he were just saying, oh, drag me away and do whatever you want with me. But he wasn't. He was saying that I have an infinite invisible. I have a divine something that knoweth my need before I do. And it is its good pleasure to give me the kingdom. And he rests back in that complete reliance. Now, of course, the situation arises that we have to consider. Was his crucifixion a lack of demonstration? was his faith in God misplaced? Or was the experience of the crucifixion a part of his demonstration? And the most that we can do is to accept his own estimate of that situation. He had seen long before that was to be his end, and he was prepared for it, and he felt that it was going to answer a good purpose, that it was going to show the world once and for all that there is no death. You see, death is the last enemy that can be overcome, and merely healing sick people or feeding them wasn't sufficient to show them the power and the presence of God. And undoubtedly, in his mind, as in the mind of the Hebrews of his day, it would be possible to show the world the experience of the resurrection and thereby convince the entire world of the rightness of Christianity. That is, the rightness of his teaching that we are immortal beings, not because we are anything of ourselves, but because God is our life. Because God is our consciousness. Because God actually is our being. Thou seest me, thou seest the Father that sent me, for I and the Father are one. Now, we have nothing, of course, beyond these scriptures to use as authority in that direction, and so we have to accept that. It does seem a strange thing to us in this day, because he himself brought to light the fact that you may have eyes and see not, you may have ears and hear not. In other words, if you haven't spiritual discernment, you cannot know the truth. That's why he didn't give this truth to the scribes and the Pharisees. That's why he only gave his message to those of his own household. That is why he did not send his disciples out to the Gentiles, to the pagans. He didn't believe the world could be saved. He thought only those of his own household, that is, those sufficiently illumined spiritually, could receive the message. So evidently he believed that the Hebrews who were following him, more especially those who had been taught in the Essens, would be able to apprehend this resurrection and thereby bring to the entire world the knowledge that I and the Father are one, and there is no use now of taking thought for our lives, what we shall eat, what we shall drink, wherewithal we shall be clothed, but rest in this realization of the invisible. Well, of course, you know how badly mistaken he was if that was his idea, because we are told that only about 500 witnessed the resurrection, and all the rest of those multitudes who had been healed and who had been fed and who had been preached to, evidently their eyes were too gross. Their ears were stopped up. They could not behold what they witnessed. It is for that reason that you do not find us in the infinite way taking large places for our meetings and hoping to convince the world that it doesn't need law courts or armies or navies or medicines, for we recognize that this must come first to those who have enough spiritual light to be able to bring it into their experience and demonstrate it, and then through their experience let it spread out further into the world as sort of a spiritual underground. You know as well as I do that if many of the things that we have said in our classes here and around the rest of the world had been said to the public, by now it wouldn't be the teacher alone who'd be crucified. I'm afraid he'd have a few thousand people along in jails and compounds with him, or locked up in madhouses. But the point is this: at some period of your experience, you must come to an actual, demonstrable experience of the fact that there is a presence within you that he called the Father within. Once you have that, you have the answer to this whole Sermon on the Mount, and you have the whole answer to the spiritual life, because now there is no more need to seek good health than to get rid of bad health. There is no more need to seek supply than to run away from lack, because in this unfoldment you stand still in divine being, not human being. Remember this: a human being must be healed, a human being must be supplied, a human being must have their lot improved, but not the child of God. The child of God is sustained by the Father within. The only question is, who is the child of God? And that we're told plainly: if so be the Spirit of God dwell in you. If you can pray for your enemies as well as for your allies. It says very definitely that you must pray for those who despitefully use you. You must pray for the enemy so that you may become the child of God. Now, when you have risen above hate and love, risen to the point where your prayer is equally for the just and the unjust, then you have risen above the pairs of opposites. Then you are at least approaching that state of consciousness in which there is neither abundance nor lack, for the simple reason that you have nothing to do with supply. It's a matter of God maintaining and sustaining its own image and likeness. You have nothing to do with health, not any more than a practitioner has to do with your health when you ask for help. The practitioner has nothing to do with your health. The practitioner has only to do with achieving a conscious realization of God's presence. And that realization is responsible for whatever of harmony comes into your experience. Not the practitioner. The demonstrated presence of God does that. And so it is. The demonstrated presence of God in your experience moves mountains. The demonstrated presence of God in your experience opens the Red Sea, multiplies the loaves and fishes. The demonstrated presence of God goes before you to make the crooked places straight. And never believe for a moment that you will ever reach a place in spiritual development when you will do those things. For it isn't so. The Master himself never got there. At every point he said, I can of my own self do nothing. If I speak of myself, I bear witness to a lie. It is this Father within that doeth the works. And Paul, the exact same thing, I can do all things but through Christ, which strengtheneth me. And so it is. The goal of our experience in the infinite way is the attainment of the realization of God, is the attainment of that moment of God contact within. Now, it is not a contact that once made will remain forever, unless one continues to live in that consciousness. In other words, many people have attained, some consciously and some without any volition on their part, have attained a moment of God realization and then not knowing how to bring it back, not knowing how to resume that relationship, have lost it. We brought out here in the March class the story of Silesius, who had this wonderful God experience which lasted for 3 days and nights. And it was of such intensity that he never again could return to his ordinary way of life. And so, although he was a Protestant, he became a Catholic so that he could take up his home in a monastery and withdraw from the human way of living. And for the rest of his days he was in the monastery, and he wrote this beautiful little volume that is available today of his experience. But he was never able to recapture the experience. He was never able again to get back inside of that God consciousness, and so he lived probably on the fringe of it all of the time, but never getting back into the depths and never knowing another deep experience. Now then, I for one am convinced that had he known about meditation and had he ever achieved it, he would have been able to go in and out by will, because it has been demonstrated to us that those who achieve the conscious experience of realization can go in and out at will, and if they go deep enough, they can live and die at will. As the Master said, lay down their life or pick it up. They can give away or lose every possession they have and begin all over today from a fresh start without a penny, and in a very short time have all they had before and more. And all of this comes because of an access to the source. Now, healing work in the infinite way is based on that very principle. If we cannot reach our source, the healing does not take place, for the simple reason that healing in our work does not take place because of some truth that we know. The truth that we learn, the letter of truth that we study, is merely to give us a foundation on which we can rest when we go into the Spirit, so that we do not go off on wrong tangents or on emotional experiences or on psychic experiences, but that we are able to maintain ourselves in the Spirit while it takes over and performs the work. Now, it is for this reason that you will find in the writings that it says we do not use the words you, he, or she, or it in a treatment. In other words, at no time is thought ever directed to the patient. At no time is it necessary to know their name or to know what ails them. At no time is it necessary to know where they are or why, and at no time is it necessary to tell them that they must be more loving or more grateful or more generous or more moral or more sober or anything else. In this work, you can take the patient when they're at death's door, and probably, if you rise high enough, even after they've passed through. In this work, you can take your patient when they are in the deepest red or black of sin. You can take them wherever they are, whenever they are, and never tell them that they must be better before they can get the benefit of the work, because it isn't true. They don't have to do anything to achieve God's kingdom except find someone that can bring to them the Spirit of God, the Spirit that is that which quickens your mortal bodies or your mortal lives. after they have received a measure of healing, after they have been lifted up out of the depth of their sin or their disease or their poverty, then it rests with them to pick up from that point on and make their own way into heaven, guided or otherwise. But for the immediate demonstration, if it were necessary for them to get good first, the chances are they'd be hopeless, because nobody ever can be better than they are. And there isn't any way that anyone can make themselves better than they are by conscious will, except a few individuals who are gifted with a great willpower which they can use, transform conditions, and in the end destroy themselves with it. Because when the repercussion sets in, when the explosion comes from repression and suppression, they're worse off than they were before. And so it is that this is not a teaching, a psychological teaching, which shows a bad man how to get good, or a sick man how to get well, or a poor man how to get abundance. It is an unfoldment which says that if you attain that spirit, or that mind which was in Christ Jesus, that spirit that raised up Jesus Christ from the dead, that it will quicken also your mortal bodies. But the secret is, get that spirit. Now, your practitioner or teacher is supposed to do that for you in your earliest experience. That is the example that the Master set for us. He did it for his followers, and he taught the disciples to go out and do likewise. But of course, with the understanding that that was not a permanent dispensation. In other words, after he fed them once, he was shocked that they would come back the next day and want to be fed again. And he called their attention to the fact that whereas they saw the loaves and fishes, they hadn't seen the miracle, that is the principle that produced it. And what he was trying to show them wasn't loaves and fishes, but a principle. And in the same way with healing, had he believed that it was necessary for them to go on forever being healed, he would not have said, if I go not away, the Comforter cannot come to you. But he recognized this fact, that if you receive a healing, it is not because the Master merely wants you to be a healthy human being instead of a sick one. If you receive a healing through the Christ, it is that you learn about a principle of life which maintains and sustains us in our spiritual identity. And so it is today. We will take up just for a minute this subject of gratitude, because there is no subject that makes it clearer what our purpose is than the subject of gratitude. I presume that if someone, not knowing the whole secret, were to be healed of a simple headache and received a bill from a practitioner for $5, they would consider it exorbitant. On the other hand, if they were healed of a cancer or consumption and received a bill for $100, they would think it was very reasonable. Now, in the light of the message of the infinite way, both of these are entirely wrong. The healing is not of headache, and the healing is not of cancer. When you come to this work, you don't receive a healing, you receive the demonstration of God's presence in your experience. And that is the thing to be grateful for, because if you have a headache, it will remove it. But if you have a cancer, it'll remove it. It makes no distinctions between a simple corn on the toe or a decayed lung. And that is what you must watch for in this work. Don't be grateful for a demonstration of $100 or $1,000. Don't ever be grateful for the healing of a physical, mental, or moral condition, because those are only the effects of what you received. What you received was the demonstration of God's presence in the midst of you. And if you understand that, it is just as easy for one treatment to heal you from head to foot as it is to go over your body piecemeal, a little here and a little there. But that can't happen while you restrict it. In accordance with your faith, be it unto you. And so if you ask for help for a headache, the chances are you're going to have enough faith to receive help for a headache, and that's probably the way it'll be. If you understand that you are not asking for physical, mental, moral, or financial healing, you are saying to the worker in the infinite way, bring to me the realization of God's presence. Bring God to my soul, to my mind, to my body. Bring the Spirit of God to my conscious awareness. And then when it's achieved, you will have had one of the grandest experiences that ever took place on earth, and are very unusual in this age, because there are so few who believe that the presence of God is as available today in our individual experience as it was 2,000 years ago with Jesus, or 3,000 years ago with Moses, and in between with Elijah and Elijah. But be assured of this: every purely spiritual healing that has ever taken place has been the direct result of God realized, God consciously realized. That is why when you meditate in our work with one of our students who have attained conscious realization of God, you will know that it's not an experience of just closing your eyes and waiting for 2 or 3 minutes to pass. You will know that you have lived 1,000 years in those few seconds, the very moment that Spirit touches you, because that is the object of our meditation. Our meditations are not meant to make demonstrations. They are meant to make God live in our experience, so that we can say we live and move and have our being in God. God in us and we in God. The Word in us and we in the Word. And all of that Word, a conscious experience. Now, there is a God, and no one here doubts it. But if there is anyone here who hasn't experienced God, they've been cheated. They've been cheated out of the greatest experience that anyone on earth can ever know, and not only that, but unless they attain some measure of God realization, they are not living the God life. You must remember that we are told over by Paul in Romans, and I know that metaphysicians especially have never had this called to their attention. Our students have, but it's very rarely spoken of. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them. But the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise. Say not in thine heart, who shall ascend into heaven? That is, to bring Christ down from above. Or who shall descend into the deep? That is, to bring Christ again from the dead. But what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. Now, that was the 10th chapter. And then to the 8th. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. And then we come down here to this. So then, they that are in the flesh cannot please God. But ye are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if so be the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die, but if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. And do you see that? There is the distinction that must be made. If you are of the flesh, then you must know that you not only cannot please God, but you cannot come under God's government. Those that are in the flesh can neither please God nor come under God's government. And that is why we have a world in sin, in disease, in death, in wars, in lack or limitation, for they are the men of flesh. And they are not receiving the Spirit of God or God's grace. It is only when you come out from being under the law of Moses, only when you come into this Sermon on the Mount and begin to give up the use of the weapons of the world, physical weapons and mental weapons, using things or using thoughts, both have to be overcome, and rise into the Spirit itself, only then does it say that you are the children of God. And if children of God, heirs, and if heirs, joint heirs with Christ in God. Now, the change from being a man of flesh who cannot please God and is not under the law of God into the man who has the Spirit of God dwelling in him and who therefore is the child of God is a conscious attainment. It is one that an individual has to make by not attempting in his life merely to gain the peace that the world can give, that is, more health or more supply or more happiness, but by attaining that mind which was in Christ Jesus, that Spirit which raised up Jesus from the dead. Now watch the difference in your demonstration the very moment that you realize this. I must live my daily life, of course. I must go out to my business, or I must keep house, or I must take care of whatever is given to me to do at this particular moment to do. That's right. And there is no shirking of any of those duties or obligations. But within me, in the inner sanctuary of my own being, I can realize this. I am not seeking the peace that this world gives, but I'm seeking the peace that the Spirit of Christ gives. I'm seeking not things, but the conscious realization of God's presence. My life is not dedicated to increasing my material good, but my spiritual awareness. Those are the first steps in, you must come out and be separate, he says. Come out from among them and be separate. And the first way that there is for us to come out and be separate is to ask ourselves, why am I on the spiritual path? What am I seeking? Is it more of this world's goods? Is it more of this world's harmonies? Is it more of this world's success? Well, even from a human standpoint, that's foolishness. When you look around you and see the amount of people who have gained health and wealth and wish they could get rid of a lot of it, it's so burdensome, or who have attained all that they thought they wanted of name and fame, and then found that it did not bring them that which they had hoped to gain through it, their ambition. Now we know that regardless of what our human attainments might be, we will find no satisfaction in them. None. The satisfaction that comes to an individual is that which comes through a spiritual attainment. And I've brought this out before because I've seen it in so many cases. The very moment you stop chasing something in life, it begins chasing you. And the very person who decides to stop chasing supply, stop chasing health, stop chasing fame, all of a sudden finds that those things are chasing him up the alleys, trying their best to overtake him. And sometimes they do, which is not bad if it comes that way. You see, when we have a health or a bodily strength which comes as the grace of God, it can only be used for a good purpose, not for dissipation, and not for throwing away, and not for wasting. In the same way, when we have a supply that comes as the grace of God, there's no such thing as using it for wrong purposes. It always finds a way of becoming used for good purposes, spiritual purposes. And so it is in all our ways. When we have renounced the way of the world, that is, the way of using the world's weapons, when we have given up the use of the law and come to the realization of life by grace, then the whole new life begins, and we find this, that every time we have a conscious realization of that spirit within, somebody in our outer world benefits by it. There too, you see, we are told that no one can have this light and keep it hidden under any baskets, because it won't stay hidden. Everyone who attains even a tiny measure of this light is called upon for it, is called upon for its use in the world's behalf. That is why as soon as a person attains some measure of spiritual light, they're called on for healing or for teaching or for instruction, for guidance or for counseling. And that is why many people wonder why there are so many failures in metaphysical work when there is so much zeal. Ah, yes, there are many who would love to be able to save the world. There are many who long to serve the world, and they have all the zeal and they have all the human integrity. But they have not yet that spiritual light without which all of the zeal and human understanding is of little avail. It's of great avail in other walks of life. Oh yes, the doctors and the nurses and the teachers Oh, there are so many people in so many walks of life that are serving grand and noble purposes, but not the spiritual. The spiritual purpose can only be served by those who attain this touch of the Spirit, and it becomes visible, it becomes tangible, and brought out. Now, getting back to our gratitude, can you not see that when you understand the purpose of this work, there is only one thing you can be grateful for, and that is every time you have a God realization, either through your own meditation or through someone else's. Then there's no difference between the healing of a headache or the healing of a cancer, for the simple reason that many times you never know in this work what you've been healed of, because you don't really know what's wrong with you. You may have a headache, or you may have a stomach ache or some other thing, and have no knowledge at all of what those things are medically that are working within that would come to light at some other time. But the lives of spiritual students proves that they are touched by far less sin and far less disease than the rest of the world, showing that some of these very times when they believe they've been healed of a headache, they were really and truly lifted out of something far worse. Now let us not put our gratitude down into the level of what we are grateful for as a thing, but what we are grateful for in real demonstration, and that is that the Spirit of God has been revealed to us here on earth in our very bodily affairs. Let our gratitude always be for the spiritual light that has been given us, and then you'll find that that form of gratitude is one of the greatest healing agencies in the world. Many people have spoken to me about this in the past and have written questions about it. I'm always grateful for a healing, and yet they say that gratitude is such a healer, but it doesn't work for me. No, being grateful for things isn't the spiritual gratitude that is a healer. The only gratitude that is a healing agency is the gratitude for God, the gratitude for God realization, the gratitude for the Christ Spirit in man, gratitude for what the world would call an intangible. Why, all the rest of the world are grateful for the tangibles. If you were in this work just a short time, you'd see how much more grateful people are in their expression of gratitude when they receive a physical, mental, moral, or financial healing than when they receive spiritual teaching. They're always much more grateful for the tangible than they are for that thing which is really the most important, the demonstration of God's presence. And that's what we all have to change in this work. Let's get over being grateful for a healing. Let's get over being grateful for supply. Let's get over being grateful for any of the joys of this world that this work brings to us, and let's learn how to be grateful that there is a God. Let us learn to be grateful that the sun, moon, and stars are not under the control of a government. Let's learn to be grateful that these great laws of like begetting like, all these great laws of love, great laws of life, are not subject to man. When we learn to look out on this entire world and even to be grateful that 2 times 2 are 4, then we're really being grateful for the spiritual things of life, and thereby we're opening ourselves to God's grace. No one can be truly grateful for God without feeling an inrush of the Spirit, whereas being grateful for the greatest healing in the world is really and truly nothing at all. Anyone can be grateful on the human plane for a physical benefit, for the peace that the world can give. But oh, for those students who can be grateful for those things that only the Spirit of God can bring, which sometimes may seem to be in the field of the intangibles, but which later get to be much more tangible than any of those things that the world is grateful for. Now, that really and truly brings to light the secret of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount takes us out of the pairs of opposites. It takes us away from the health and no health, the supply and no supply, and takes us into that world of the Spirit where we relax and judge not after appearances, judge not at all as to whether it's health or unhealth, but whether we stand in that Spirit. And that, of course, is going to lead us to the place that makes it, well, I was going to say simple, but that's not quite true, but more simple to demonstrate the Sermon on the Mount, and that is when we come to this subject of neither good nor evil. Those of you who have studied the writings well know that all the way through the writings we are based on that particular premise of neither good nor evil, that our attempt never has been to change evil into good in any way. And now, in order to make that live and come alive in our experience, we are going to have, and we'll take this up tomorrow night, the beginning of this subject of good and evil. Meanwhile, let us take these questions. How does one give God all the honor and power and glory? Well, right there. If you look behind the scene, the visible scene, and acknowledge always that there is an invisible producing the visible, you will be giving all honor and glory to God. The very moment that we believe you and I are responsible for something, we are taking from that. But when you, for instance, look out at the growing crops, the trees, fruits, and realize that there is an unseen presence and power responsible for that, then you're giving all honor and glory unto God. When you look at a monumental piece of work like the Golden Gate Bridge or the Empire State Building or something of that nature, and realize what lies back of that creation, realize the spiritual laws that existed before Abraham was, that men have merely brought to light in order to bring these creations to us. Every time you fly in a plane, and just think of yourself sitting up 4 or 5 miles above the earth, as comfortably as if you were in your own home. Think of that miracle. And then remember this, that it wasn't men who created this. There were spiritual laws that men discovered, spiritual laws that existed before the Wright brothers, spiritual laws that existed before Leonardo da Vinci, spiritual laws that existed before Abraham was ever on earth or before the Aryan race began, and it is those spiritual laws that are holding us up in the air in those planes. Always remember this as you read of this coming atomic age, and I'm thinking, of course, of its constructive side. Remember this, that these laws have existed since before there was a man on earth to realize them. That's how to give glory and honor to God, by recognizing that nothing has been achieved on this earth that wasn't achieved through the recognition of something that God created in the beginning. The very automobiles that we drive around with gasoline, if you stop to think of the fact of the thousands of years that oil was in formation, and of how it got into the earth and how the transformation took place in the earth, you'll know that there was an invisible law operating to produce all of that. And it is by recognizing that it is the invisible, the infinite invisible, that is responsible for everything that's visible, that you are giving all honor and credit where it belongs. It's perfectly right to be thankful to Jesus Christ for what he revealed to us of spiritual law. It is just as right to be grateful to Moses for having given us that which was necessary first, the moral law. It certainly is right to be grateful to Benjamin Franklin and to the Wright brothers and to Kettering and all of those who have made life comfortable. But how can we be grateful to them at all without realizing that they are but the instruments through which divine law has been brought into our experience? There is no other way on earth. It is the same in this work. If through a spiritual teaching your life is made better, it is certainly right and just that you be grateful to every spiritual teacher who has ever been responsible for bringing that into our experience. I've tried to make this clear to many classes, that a person who is along on this spiritual path who doesn't recognize the work of people like Mrs. Eddy or Mrs. Fillmore or Emily Cady or any of those early workers on this path, they are just overlooking the entire secret of their harmony in today's experience. For every one of those was a pioneer passing on to us that which had been revealed to them and which we have the privilege of using, and if we dedicate our lives to it, carrying on even to higher measure. For there never will be a time when the grace of God will be completely realized by man. God's grace is infinite, and we have only the capacity to understand and demonstrate in proportion to our developed consciousness. But remember this, that the more we develop our consciousness, the more we lay the foundation for the next generation to develop theirs to even a greater extent. We have developed ours with these principles that have been given to us by Jesus and John and Paul and Mrs. Eddy and all the rest of these people. But the next generation and the one after that will have, in addition to it, all that we can pass on to them. And so it must be, recognition can be given to everybody on the spiritual plane of discovery or the material one of invention and discovery and science. But to give complete honor and glory to God, bear witness to the fact that none of these people could have achieved anything if there hadn't been some spiritual truth for them to bring forth in human form. And now this is, if there is no such thing as time or space in reality, how is it that an individual state of consciousness seems to get so much more of an unfoldment during attendance at a class, when it is possible to get help from Hawaii to New York or Timbuktu? Well, of course, the answer is this, that there's no such thing as time or space in reality, and to receive this help from afar off, it becomes necessary for an individual themselves to rise above time and space. While they themselves are limiting themselves by time and space, they have no way of receiving the help that is not only available from Hawaii or New York or Timbuktu, but may I go further and say the help that is available from Jesus Christ or from any of the great masters who have ever lived and who are still living, those who have never died. There is no reason why we can't reach back in time and space as well as forward. But it requires a consciousness that in some